Hello, everybody. Welcome back to an episode of Red Dead Redemption Character Analysis. We're back here. Remember, I mentioned in the last Red Dead Redemption 1 character analysis, it would probably take a while to get some gameplay, because this is our Red Dead. Now we're moving on to Red Dead 2 only characters. So we did all the characters featured in Red Dead 1 and Red Dead 2. Now we're doing Red Dead 2 only characters, so like Arthur, which is what we're doing. We're talking about Arthur today. We're also going to talk about a lot of different other characters, because it's so rich in, like, characters, and a lot of interesting characters in Red Dead 2. There's just so much to talk about, and obviously Arthur, he's a big character, obviously the main character in the game, and there's just so much to talk about here, about Arthur specifically. But it takes me a little while to get gameplay and stuff here for Red Dead because I film it on my PlayStation, and I can only film it in or record gameplay in 3 minute intervals. It's a little bit more tricky than if I were to record gameplay on my Xbox. So it's a little bit more tricky, but regardless, I'll make it work. But yeah, sometimes it'll just take me longer to get gameplay on PlayStation, for like character analysis and stuff. So that's kind of might be why like character analysis might not be, at least for Red Dead 2, it might take me a little bit extra. So just to put that out there, but yeah, we're going to be talking about Arthur today, and like I said, he's a very interesting character. I mean, not only is he the main character, he's very rich in history. There's a lot of stuff for him to talk about here. Obviously, getting all my info from the Red Dead Wiki, and there's just so much stuff on here. Um, so yeah, just going to get right into it. So the background of Arthur Morgan, kind of going to go through the history, and we're going to go through what happens in the story. So if you obviously haven't assumed it already, major spoilers for Red Dead Redemption 2, particularly with Arthur, because obviously, Arthur's the main character and a lot of stuff happens, with Arthur and, in the end of Red Dead 2. But if you haven't played Red Dead 2 by now, first of all, I would highly recommend it because it's an amazing game. Also, it's been out for quite a few amount of years now. But spoilers ahead, just in case, anybody watching this, hasn't played it, there'll be spoilers. Um, yeah, just to put it out there. But yeah, just to get in here, the background. Arthur Morgan was born circa 1863 to Beatrice and Lyle Morgan in the northern United States. As a child, his mother died of unknown causes, while his father was a petty criminal and outlaw, which it's mentioned a lot of times in the game. And there's also some pictures in Arthur's wagon, if you'll see, if you're playing the story. In 1874, when Arthur was 11 years old, his father was arrested for larceny. Morgan later witnessed his death, and despite a strained relationship with him, still donned his hat and kept a picture of him on his wagon. Again, I mentioned that. Around 1877, Arthur was found as a wild delinquent and picked up off the streets by Dutch Vanderlyn and Hosea Matthews, which we'll be talking about Hosea later in the Red Dead 2 character analysis. Just because he's also a very important character in the Vanderlyn gang. Just to mention that as well. But viewing the pair as surrogate father figures, Arthur came to share Dutch's vision of a life lived free from the constraints of civilization and the rule of law. The pair taught him how to read, write, hunt, fight, shoot, and ride, becoming the first protege as well as one of the founding members of the Vanderlyn gang. And a little later, Arthur met Susan Grimshaw as she got engaged with Dutch and joined the gang, acting as a tough mother figure as it's seen in the actual game. Arthur also found a pet dog named Copper. At some point when he grew particularly close to and occasionally took baths with, or baths. Although Arthur had difficulty controlling him, he admired the dog's spirit. Copper later had passed away, and Arthur kept a picture of him on his wagon. He also acquired a mare at some point named Boadicea, to whom he became fond of, although she passed away sometime before the gang's arrival at Coulter, which it's, a lot of this stuff is mentioned in the game, or you could see it, kind of stuff like that. So a lot of it's mentioned. But as a young adult, Arthur met a girl named Mary Gillis, where the two fell deeply in love and even became engaged. He befriended her younger brother Jamie and taught him horseback riding. However, Arthur's preference for a life of crime, coupled with the prevalent disapproval of Mary's family, most strongly from her father, ultimately caused their relationship to fall apart and the pair separated. In 1884, Arthur was sent out fishing, pridefully returned with 3 beautiful bass. The gang celebrated with a big feast and toasted him all night long. The following week, Arthur and Dutch walked into a local market where it was revealed that he had simply purchased the bass from a fishmonger, much to his embarrassment. I didn't even know that. That's a pretty funny little detail here. And see, this is why the Red Dead Wiki, and kind of like all the game wikis, are so interesting, because there's a lot of stuff I'm learning here, and maybe you guys too, that I don't even know about this story, so it's pretty interesting. In 1885, Arthur met a 12-year-old boy named John Marston, who had been saved by Dutch from being lynched by a group of Illinois homesteaders. John was inducted into the gang and raised alongside Arthur, with the pair growing close as brothers. Dutch instilled the boys with his anarchist worldviews against the corrupt government and preached that revenge was a fool's game, and over the years Arthur and John became regarded as Dutch's favorite sons. In 1887, Arthur participated in the gang's first major bank robbery alongside Dutch and Hosea. At 2 o'clock, the trio burst into the banking house of Lee and Hoyt and managed to make off with $5,000 in gold. After the robbery, they lingered in town, going to hovels and shanties and orphanages, handing out money, envisioning themselves as Robin Hood figures. It was following this event where Arthur became a wanted man. Some years later, Arthur met and slept with a 19-year-old waitress named Eliza, resulting in her becoming pregnant with their son Isaac. Although Eliza knew of Arthur's lifestyle, she accepted whatever support he offered her and their son. Arthur, not wanting to promise anything he couldn't keep, said that he would do right by them. He would also periodically visit Eliza and Isaac every few months and stay with them for days at a time. Arthur remembered fondly of Isaac as a good kid. Tragically, one day, Arthur, however, arrived at their home and saw 2 crosses outside. He knew immediately that they were both dead, and later he learned that they had been shot and killed by robbers, all for $10. This dramatic incident hardened Arthur as a result, and he never truly coped with the pain and gave him understanding to not live the life of an outlaw and expect good things to happen to him. Which is actually, I feel like I heard that story before, somewhere around here, about Arthur's son and stuff like that. So that's pretty interesting as well. In 1894, a prostitute named Abigail Roberts joined the Vanderlyn gang. At some point, she fell in love with John Marston and became pregnant with their son named Jack. Arthur became a surrogate uncle figure towards him growing up. John, however, refused to accept responsibility over the boy and soon left the gang. Around a year later, John returned while Dutch and the majority of the gang welcomed him back with open arms. Arthur felt betrayed by his actions, and a rift was formed between the two, which steadily grew over the years. By 1898, the gang had found itself in Montana. During their stay, Hosea caught several large salmon during a fishing trip and planned to prepare a feast for the whole camp. However, the feast was cut short when Copper found and ate the fish, passing away soon after. After the fire, in which Arthur's old journal was lost and had some trouble up north, the gang traveled south and east, taking a slow and torturous trail down the northern grizzlies to throw off anyone tracking them. Then they spent several months in the wilderness. During the winter, they stuck mostly to the western foothills of the mountain. While traversing the grizzlies, several new members were picked up and brought into the gang. A young teenager, Lenny Summers, and drifting outlaw Charles Smith, which we'll talk about too. Arthur had generally fair opinions of the pair, eventually forming close bonds with the two. Later on, the gang came across Jenny Kirk, a young woman abandoned by the roadside. The most member inducted into the gang was Micah Bell, or the most recent member, a hot-headed career outlaw who saved Dutch's life in a shootout. Although Dutch found a liking to Micah, Arthur openly disliked him for his tendencies, and by the spring of 1899, the gang had arrived in West Elizabeth and decided to hide in plain sight just outside Blackwater, a town undergoing the process of industrialization, as you'll see, a lot of construction around there. The gang began to scope out many leads, including Arthur and Hosea, who were planning a hefty real estate scam. Despite this, Dutch was also planning something big. Supported by Micah, Dutch began working on plans to rob a ferry laden with riches coming to town. Hosea and Arthur were reluctant despite Dutch's beliefs. His plan was to carry out the heist and flee west, possibly into New Austin. Then after Arthur and Hosea carried out their scam, they would join the gang the following day. Unfortunately, the ferry heist did not go as expected. At some point during the robbery, the gang was ambushed by the Pinkertons, causing a massive firefight known as the Blackwater Massacre. Arthur and Hosea arrived late, and by then the gang was barely holding on. Several gang members were killed or seriously injured. Then they fled in the area in an almighty scramble north to the mountains in hopes of avoiding the law. Arthur suspected that the heist might have been a setup. Now we're going to kind of get, that was the history more or less of Arthur Morgan and how he joined the gang. Now we're going to get into the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 and what happens in the base game. So in the Coulter chapter, after a botched ferry heist, Dutch and the gang were forced to flee Blackwater and attempt to cross the mountains west to evade law enforcement. Not long after taking shelter in the abandoned mining town of Coulter, Dutch and Arthur go looking for either John Marston or Micah Bell, both of whom went scouting ahead. Arthur and Dutch find Micah, who informs them of a homestead he found which appears to have a party going inside. They stop the homestead to ask for help, where they encounter members of the O'Driscoll boys. After meeting them, a gunfight breaks out which results in the deaths of the O'Driscolls. After looting the ranch, they encounter Sadie Adler, whose husband was killed by the O'Driscolls. Taking pity on her condition, they bring her back to the camp, and not long after returning, Arthur is asked by Abigail Roberts to find John Marston, who has gone missing. Arthur and Javier Escuela find John seriously wounded and scarred across his face after being attacked by wolves, and they bring him back to camp where he begins to recover. And a few days later, Dutch plans an ambush on the O'Driscoll camp, which is situated nearby. According to an O'Driscoll they interrogated at the homestead, the gang attacks the camp, and after defeating them, they find dynamite and information about a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall that the O'Driscolls intended to rob. On the way back down to Coulter, they come across an O'Driscoll, what they previously saw being reprimanded by Colm. Arthur volunteers to catch him and succeeds, learning that his name is Kieran, and the gang ties him up in stables after starving him for information. Due to the gang's hasty escape from Blackwater, food and supplies were short in supply. Arthur ventures out with Charles Smith to find some food, during which Charles gave Arthur a bow and tells him that he'll have to use it due to the hand injury with the former sustained during the failed ferry robbery. The two share a friendly conversation discussing their history both in and outside the gang. While Charles provides Arthur with some hunting tips, Arthur manages to take down 2 deer so he and Charles can return to camp with enough food to let the gang last a few days. In order to fund their escape from the mountains, Dutch has the gang rob the Cornwall train that it mentioned from the O'Driscolls. However, the detonator that the gang planned to use fails, which was a really funny scene with Bill. I should probably already mention it, but so they also have to chase after the train. Arthur, Lenny, and Javier jump onto the train from above, although Javier falls off immediately, and Lenny also slips, but manages to grasp onto the carriage. After Arthur helps him up, the two manage to fight their way through the train and slay most of the guards, before the rest of the gang arrives and finishes off the remaining few. The gang uses dynamite to enter the private car, which they manage to find some highly valuable state bonds. Dutch then leaves Arthur to leave with the last 3 guards as he wishes, all of whom had surrendered, and their fate is therefore left to the player. And after dealing with them, Arthur rides back to Coulter, and this is kind of where we're going to get into the Horseshoe Overlook chapter. So it's chapter 2, I think, that's chapter 2, I think. But after the thaw comes in, the gang leaves the mountains for a new location, the Heartlands, near the town of Valentine. Arthur goes to the saloon in Valentine where he meets Javier, Charles, and later Bill. A bar fight breaks out, and Bill drunkenly attacks someone after entering the saloon, which is some of the gameplay you'll see in this video here. It was probably earlier, but you saw it already. After fighting out some men, Arthur eventually engages in a huge burly man named Tommy, who overpowers him, and Arthur throws him out of the saloon window onto the muddy street outside, and after a bitter brawl, Arthur defeats him and beats him severely, stopping only when Thomas Downs plead for him to do so. After the fight has ended, Arthur is called over by Dutch where he meets Josiah Trelawney. Again, he learns that Sean Maguire is alive, and they make plans to rescue him. Dutch also sends Arthur to accompany Trelawney, Charles Smith, and Javier Escuela in rescuing Sean. During the attempt, Arthur takes part in the frontal assault along with Trelawney and Javier, while Charles scouts from a distance, and after a bloody firefight with the bounty hunter, Sean is rescued, and the gang members return to camp, throwing a party with his safe return. Arthur also goes on a hunt for a 1,000-pound bear with Hosea, who gives Arthur a raven Blackshire horse, of which he can choose to either sell or keep at the stables in Valentine. The two set out in the grizzly east to find the bear. After setting some bait, the two wait for the bear, who attacks them. Hosea thanks Arthur for saving his life and gives him a match for the legendary animals. The two can either part ways or go back to camp together, and usually I keep that black horse, because that's a cool Shire horse. I really like it. So Arthur proceeds to interrogate the O'Driscoll that the gang captured in the mountains. Dutch calls Bill over to castrate Karen with burning hot tongs if he doesn't reveal the location of Colm O'Driscoll. Kieran then says he's at 6 Point Cabin and is accompanied there by Arthur, John, and Bill. Upon reaching the hideout, the trio stealthily take out some of the O'Driscolls before a shootout eventually ensues. Arthur enters the cabin in hope of finding Colm, but is instead surprised by an O'Driscoll goon. Before Arthur can be killed, Kieran appears and fatally shoots the O'Driscoll, saving Arthur's life. Arthur then threatens him after Colm is not there, believing that he set him up. Kieran points out that he wouldn't have saved Arthur's life if that were the case, and with some more prompting from John and Bill, Kieran is allowed to stay with the gang. And he also can go buffalo hunting with Charles at some point during this chapter, and he could also rob the homestead of Ches Porter, the creepy one, with Javier, which is a really creepy mission. And then at some point, Arthur will receive a letter from Mary Linton, who asks Arthur to meet her. After reading the letter, Arthur is told by Leopold Strauss that he needs to recover a debt from Thomas Downs, a rancher. Arthur goes to Downs' ranch and confronts Mr. Downs. Thomas says he is destitute, prompting Arthur to beat him. Eventually, Thomas's wife Edith arrives, saying that her husband is ill and truly are destitute. Leading Arthur to leaving the ranch, Arthur can meet Mary soon afterwards, who tells him that her brother Jamie has been killed, inducted into a Beatty cult, known as the Trelawneyans. If Arthur agrees to help her, which is up to the player, if he will find Jamie with them near the Cumberland Forest. Arthur scares them off and chases them, escaping Jamie, eventually catching him and shooting the gun out of his hand when he tries to kill himself before him returning him to Mary. There's some stuff I'm going to skip over here just because it's so much articles, but there's a lot of stuff about Micah and Lenny and stuff like that we're going to talk about that Arthur does. We're going to be talking about that in Micah's character analysis and Lenny's character analysis, which we're going to do. But just to kind of skip over a little bit here because we'll be talking about that later in the character analysis. I just kind of wanted to address that. Just I'm skipping over some stuff just to kind of just because there's so much more stuff to talk about in terms of Arthur, because it goes over a lot of the missions that Arthur does. But kind of going out to skip over, John contacts Arthur and tells him that he heard of a train that will be moving through Valentine. He suggests that in order to get the train to stop, Arthur should steal a stagecoach carrying Cornwall oil. Arthur can steal the stagecoach and rendezvous with Sean, Charles, and John. After putting the stagecoach in front of the train, it screeches to a halt and the gang boards it. Charles deals with the engineer. John goes down the train with a bag of loot, and Arthur provides some encouragement for those so not willing to give. He then goes looking for Sean, who is supposed to have dealt with the baggage car. Only for him to have gone. Arthur eventually finds him in a tussle with the guard, who Arthur kills. The robbery is then cut short when the law descending upon them. The 4 gang members are forced to flee and manage to escape the law. John, who thinks they still need more money, talks to Arthur and tells him that he hears of a herd of sheep coming in. He tells Arthur to buy a sniper rifle, and they ride up to the hill, shooting bullets at the ranch hands. They flee, and Arthur corrals the sheep to the auction. The man who runs the auction recognizes the sheep, and they say if they pay him 25% of all profits, he will keep his mouth shut. The sum falls to 18% after John negotiates with him. Arthur and John then go to a nearby saloon where they meet Strauss and Dutch. During the meeting, Leviticus Cornwall and his hired guns capture Strauss and John. Dutch and Arthur rescue them before fighting their way out of town before going back to camp. Realizing that they can't stay in the area, Dutch sends Arthur and Charles to investigate Dewberry Creek, a possible camp location suggested by Micah. Arthur and Charles instead discover a German mother and her children with their father missing. Charles manages to trace the father to Clements Point, where they fight off some bandits and free him. Arthur returns him to his family, while Charles returns to the others to divert the caravan to Clements Point, a much better location for the camp in general. After moving to a new camp location, Hosea, Arthur, and Dutch go out riding. They encounter Sheriff Lee Gray, who has captured Trelawney due to him running an illegal gold prospecting operation. After Arthur recaptures the group of outlaws who escaped, Trelawney is released. In addition, Gray decides to deputize Arthur, Dutch, and Bill Williamson in order to crack down on the Lemoyne Raiders. Moonshine operation. With the help of Deputy Archibald McGregor, the 3 gang members succeed in bringing down the Moonshine operation, earning favor with the sheriff. Dutch tells Arthur to go to Caliga Hall to gather more information about the Gray family. He ends up talking to Beau Gray, who asks him to go to Braithwaite Manor and deliver a letter to his secret lover Penelope Braithwaite. And after delivering the letter to her, she gives him one of the women's suffrage rally. The news is that Penelope, is going to a women's suffrage rally, alarms Beau, and he tells Arthur that her life is in danger, offering him money if he will help him save her. Arthur and Beau ride up to the carriage where the protesters will be riding in, and when they are unsuccessful in convincing her to leave, Arthur is tasked with driving the carriage to protect her. At Penelope's request, Arthur takes Beau away to save him from his cousins. Arthur is subsequently paid by Beau before he then returns to camp. Dutch grows concerned over Trelawney's disappearance and sends Arthur and Charles to find him. They find a caravan he had been staying in, which has blood on the floor and signs that Trelawney had left in a hurry. The 2 track his trail to a small camp where they discover some of his belongings. The pair are attacked by 2 bounty hunters at the camp, whom they promptly subdue. They interrogate one of the bounty hunters, who reveals that Trelawney is being held at a nearby farmhouse. The duo ride over and find him being escorted into a cabin by a few bounty hunters. They attack the bounty hunters and they flee into a nearby tobacco field. The 2 venture into the field and hunt down the remaining bounty hunters before returning to Trelawney. He insists that he told them nothing, and they bring him back to camp safely. Later on, Arthur is asked by Uncle if he wants to join a stagecoach robbery. Along with Charles and Bill, Arthur accepts the offer. Unfortunately for them, the stagecoach turns out to be owned by Cornwall, who has hired a small army of private mercenaries to protect his stagecoach. After robbing the stagecoach, the gang members are forced to flee to a nearby barn where they attempt to hide. The hired guns, however, find them and light the barn on fire while opening the fire on them at the same time. The men are forced to fight their way out of the barn and into the forest, where they engage some of the Cornwall's men in combat before escaping back to camp. In a later mission, Bill and Karen Jones approach Lenny and Arthur and propose robbing the Valentine Bank, which they have already collected information on. After a bit of prodding, he agrees, and the 4 ride to Valentine. Karen pretends to be either a lost girl or a harlot. After confusing the guard, knocks him out. Arthur can either place dynamite on the safes to blow the locks off, or silently crack them. On the way out, they are attacked by the law, but the four gang members succeed in fighting the way to safety. Afterward, Arthur rides to Downs' ranch to get the money from Edith Downs that her husband owed. And at some point, the gang hears that O'Driscolls have planned a truce meeting for Dutch and Colm, although Hosea instantly sees it as a trap, of course. Dutch agrees to check it out, and after some persuasion from Micah, Arthur, who is also suspicious, accompanies them. He is said to be a sniper on the cliff overlooking the meeting, but is captured by the O'Driscolls and later imprisoned in their hideout. As well as being shot in the shoulder, Colm reveals himself to Arthur and says that they are captured as Arthur as a way of luring Dutch in, so that they could give him to the Pinkertons. After Colm leaves, Arthur cauterizes his wound and makes his escape back to camp, where it takes a few weeks to recover. The gang will then decide that in order to get some more money for the stories, they will rob both the Braithwaites and the Greys. Arthur first will go with Sean, and the two will light the Greys' tobacco fields on fire using moonshine, in exchange for a significant sum of money from the Braithwaites. He will then go with John and Javier, and the two will go to Braithwaite Manor, steal the family's prized horses, although they are told by Tavish Grey that they can sell the horses to a horse fence for $5,000 in cash. This proves to be a lie, and they end up with measly $700. The gang is then told by the Greys to meet them at Rhodes for a potential job opportunity. Bill, Micah, and Sean go to Rhodes, shortly followed by Arthur. However, it turns out to be an ambush. Sean is shot dead and almost immediately, and Bill is taken captive by Sheriff. Micah and Arthur clear the street before confronting Sheriff Grey and his deputies. Sheriff Grey exits the office holding Bill hostage, but then is immediately shot and killed by Arthur. Before his deputies are then gunned down by Arthur and Micah. Afterwards, Arthur expresses his affection for Sean and then asks Bill to give him proper burial. So it's a really sad scene for Sean. Yeah, it's just real sad to see. Here comes one of my favorite missions in the game. Upon returning to camp, Arthur hears that Braithwaites have taken Jack captive in revenge for stealing their horses. A large posse of gang members attack Braithwaite Manor, and after a long fight, take Catherine Braithwaite captive. After she refuses to reveal the location of Jack, they burn down her manor. She then reveals that her sons gave him to Angelo Bronte, an Italian crime lord living in Saint Denis. Before running into her burning home and the gang leaves her, Arthur returning to camp, agents Milton and Ross appear once again with a proposition for Dutch to turn himself in exchange for the rest of the gang being allowed to flee and be pardoned. The offer is turned down and Milton leaves, promising to return with 50 men. The gang then quickly prepares to relocate to Shady Belle, which Lenny and Arthur had previously cleared off the Lemoyne Raiders. John and Arthur will go to scope it out and kill the remaining Raiders. Once this is done, the gang will move into their new home. And moving on to the Saint Denis chapter, after relocating to Shady Belle, John, Dutch, and Arthur go to Saint Denis, find out where Bronte lives. Arthur eventually learns that he lives at a mansion near the river, and chasing a street urchin that stole from him, the trio goes to confront him. The three gang members enter the house, and after almost starting a gunfight with his men, they strike a deal. John and Arthur will deal with a group of grave robbers, and in exchange, Bronte will give Jack back. The two men go to the graveyard, and after being ambushed by the criminals, gun them down, and then they grab their loot, and then escape before the law shows up. The two will return to Bronte with the loot, and Bronte will release Jack after offering Dutch an invite to the mayor's party. Bill, Hosea, and Dutch also arrive at the mayor's party. This is the mayor's party mission, of course. And quickly break up so they can pursue different leads. Arthur will hear a servant talking about Leviticus Cornwall, and after being prompted by Dutch, will follow him. Arthur will steal documents relating to him before fleeing the mansion and meeting up with the rest of the gang. Although Bill complains that they have found no leads, Hosea said he has found a few clues, including a potential riverboat robbery involving a high-stakes poker game, and even the Lemoyne National Bank. After hearing about the riverboat trip, Trelawney decides to use it to their advantage. He pulls some strings and succeeds in getting Javier, Strauss, and Arthur and himself on board, as well as befriending the dealer to rig the poker game. While on board, Javier managed to pose as a guard on the riverboat, and Strauss finds a seat in Arthur's view. Arthur then gets into the poker game with Desmond Blythe and some of the others on the boat, and with Strauss's help in cheating, Arthur wins. After losing all of his money to Arthur, Blythe offers one final bet in which he uses his Reutlinger pocket watch as credit. Arthur accepts Blythe's offer and beats him. The pit boss arrives and congratulates Arthur on his win, before escorting both him and Javier upstairs to the vault where the Reutlinger is located. After he opens up the vault, Javier and Arthur point their guns at him and tell him to surrender his hidden pistol. While Arthur loots at the vault, the pit boss draws a second hidden gun, so Arthur is forced to shoot him. Unfortunately, the sound of the gunshot alerts the guards, who rush to see what happened. Arthur and Javier reunite with Strauss and Trelawney, but the guards discover that they were the culprits of the attack. After fighting off some guards, the group jump off the ship and swim to shore, where they divide the spoils. Later on, Arthur goes to talk to an Indian chief named Rainsfall. He finds them at Saint Denis along with his son Eagle Flies. Rainsfall tells Arthur that the U.S. Army plans on moving their tribe off their land, and he has a proposition for him. He asks Arthur to steal incriminating documents from the Cornwall refinery, which could potentially put a stop to their relocation. Arthur accepts and later sneaks into the refinery using a wagon destined for the storage area. After forcing a man to give him the papers, he makes his escape, and after being held at gunpoint by a group of guards, Eagle Flies causes an explosion, distracting them and allowing Arthur to quickly gun them down. The two escape together, and after which Eagle Flies pays Arthur and says that he hopes that the documents will help. In a later mission, Sadie asks Arthur to talk and tells him that Kieran has disappeared, and she is worried about him. Almost immediately after she has finished speaking, Kieran's decapitated body comes into camp, and the O'Driscolls assault the gang. The gang attempts to hold them off at the road, but are forced to retreat inside the plantation house. It is then that Dutch realizes that Sadie is outside and is fighting for her life. Arthur charges out and kills the people attacking Sadie, but she refuses to go inside, preferring that to avenge her husband. The two engage members of the enemy gang and force the O'Driscolls to retreat. At some point in this chapter, Arthur can join Micah in robbing a stagecoach, bringing Bill along as well as this. He can also rob a stagecoach with Lenny, although it proves to be set up. Additionally, Arthur can go wrestling with Uncle. Just some extra missions you can do here. Dutch tells Arthur to come over and tells him that two of them, as well as Lenny, are going to rob the Saint Denis trolley station. After getting a tip from Angelo Bronte, the three break into the station and holds the clerks at gunpoint before realizing that only $90 are in the vault. The three then attempt to escape, but the police are now everywhere. They board the trolley and use it to ride out of the city center. The trolley eventually crashes, forcing the three to fight the policemen on foot. Eventually, the commanders on a stagecoach, or they commandeer a stagecoach, I should say, and ride to safety. Dutch then comments on how he thinks Lenny saved them, and Arthur gives them each $15 and a quarter. Now, some people say that this is where Dutch's, this is kind of where Dutch went crazy after the trolley crashed, and he had like a head injury, something like that. Some people say that, but in my personally, I would agree. But you never know. Maybe it could have happened beforehand. But moving on here, back at camp, Arthur asks Dutch to come up to the balcony. He then tells him that he and Jose can't agree on what to do next, and that he has the tiebreaker. Dutch says that he wants to kill Angelo Bronte for tricking them, and says it will make the robbing the bank easier. Jose, meanwhile, says that the plan is foolhardy, and said that it will only endanger them. Arthur sides with Dutch, and then the two go to Le Gras, where they are going to broker a deal with a fisherman named Thomas. Dutch talks to him, and then they agree that they will aid him in finding his assistant, who has gone missing. In exchange, he will ferry the gang to Bronte's mansion. The three men find him in the swamp. His name's Jules. That's what Thomas's friend is named. But he brings them to the boat and start rowing back to Le Gras. Unfortunately, along the way, they're attacked by a massive alligator. He bites the young man's leg and throws him into the water. They pull him out and shoot the giant alligator, scaring it off before returning it to Le Gras. When Arthur returns to Le Gras, the gang boards Thomas's boat and make their way towards Angelo Bronte's mansion. Once they're there, the gang gets shot at and takes cover and opens fire on the guards positioned in the courtyard. Reinforcements arrive, but the gang secures the area and approach the door. Arthur blasts the lock off the door, and the gang begins clearing the rooms. Arthur goes upstairs and enters a room, only to be surprised attacked by the crime lord after subduing Bronte. Arthur carries him downstairs, and they head toward the boat, and unfortunately policemen hear the gunshots and arrive, forcing the gang to fight their way out the boat. Once they're on the boat, they set off to Le Gras, planning on ransoming back Bronte. However, Bronte believes that the gang will turn on Dutch for money. He offers thousands of dollars to whoever kills Dutch. And when no one takes him up on that offer, begins insulting Dutch. An enraged Dutch responds by drowning Bronte, and then throwing his body overboard and being ravaged by alligators, shocking the rest of the gang, in particular Arthur and John, which is really it's a really interesting scene to see, to say the least. At camp, Dutch and Jose finalize the plan for the robbing of the Saint Denis Bank, this is also a very important mission, by the way. The gang readies and rides out the next morning, and on the ride, Dutch goes over the plan. Jose and Abigail will cause a diversion to divert police away from the bank, while the rest of the gang will enter the bank's front doors. Once inside, Arthur loots the safe when suddenly the Pinkertons arrive. The bank is completely surrounded, and Agent Milton calls for them to surrender, holding Jose hostage. After refusing, Dutch pleads for negotiation. Milton shoots Jose in the chest, killing him and angering both Dutch and Arthur. The gang attacks Pinkertons in full force, and a shootout ensues. Dutch instructs Arthur to use dynamite to blow a hole through the side of the bank in order to create a path of escape. Arthur blows open the wall and makes his way to the rooftop, where he proceeds to lay down cover fire so the gang can make a run for it. The gang joins Arthur on the roof without John, who has been captured by the Pinkertons. As the group tries to escape on the roof, Lenny is gunned down by Pinkertons, and Arthur pauses a moment to mourn his fallen friend, which is really a sad scene, kind of how quick it happened. The gang then make their way to an abandoned building where they wait until nightfall before heading to the docks where they hope to find a boat to ferry them away. Unfortunately, the police have the area under heavy surveillance and they cannot continue. Charles causes a distraction, allowing the rest of the gang to reach the dock. They then board a ship destined for Cuba, but the boat sinks and Arthur is separated from the rest of the gang. And now we're moving on to big hated chapter. A lot of people hate the Guarma chapter just mainly because it's filler, but I think it's also an important chapter in terms of the story. Now Arthur washes up on the shore of Guarma and searches for civilization. He comes upon the gang at campfire, but the reunion is cut short by the revival of the local military, who arrest them and transport them in shackles to jail. Along the way to the jail, the rebels bombard their soldiers with bullets. In the confusion, Arthur collects the keys from a dead soldier's corpse and uses them to unlock the shackles. After killing off the guards leading them to Hercule Fontaine, the revolutionary leader tells the gang to follow him. As they rush away, Javier is shot in the leg by reinforcements, and they are forced to leave without him. Despite this, Hercule leads the remaining gang to a small rebel outpost stocked with rifles. Reinforcements soon arrive, but the gang and Hercule are ultimately victorious. They then proceed to a church rebel outpost named La Capilla, and after arriving at La Capilla, Arthur rests for a short time before setting out to find a way off the island. One of the two things he has to do to get off the island is going with Dutch to rescue Javier. The two of them go to a cave where an old lady named Gloria is. Dutch pays her a gold ingot to help them lead her through the caves and stuff like that. And then after that, they start to go up to a ladder that would bring them up to Agua Dulces. It is then that she demands more money. And when Dutch can't pay the rest of the promised money, she pulls a knife on him. Dutch then grabs her and kills her, prompting dismay from Arthur, who questions him. The two of them then enter Agua Dulces, where they see Colonel Fusar and a group of soldiers who are dragging Javier along with a donkey and beating him for information on who the gang are. The pair quickly begins looking for ways to the distraction, where they find in the sugar refinery. Dutch cuts up bags of sugar, spilling it all over the floor before they blow up the furnace. In distraction, they fight their way to Javier. Although Dutch picks them up, they flee the settlement until they reach the river of Aurora de la Vibora. Sorry if I pronounced that name wrong. But at the river, Dutch tells Dutch to take Javier that he holds a bank. Waves of enemies assault his position, but Arthur prevails and then departs. Arthur then goes and investigates a group of workers who have disappeared. Arthur is unfortunately captured and imprisoned with two other militants. The guard approaches him and is about to beat up when he attacks. Arthur swiftly slays the guard, then with another militant sneak through the camp to save the three men from execution before engaging and defeating the soldiers. After doing this, he goes up with the gang to Cinco Torres. Here they see a Cuban warship approaching and swarms the enemies attacking. The gang and Hercule shoot at them from above until they reach the fort. Hercule and Dutch and Arthur rush and clear out the soldiers that they are preparing to take the fort. They then rush back to the top of Cinco Torres and man the cannon as the warship approaches. After many shots, the warship falls and they begin planning on making their escape off the island. The gang is preparing to leave, but they then see a gun battery preventing their escape. Realizing it has to be silenced, the gang assaults the battery, and Arthur blows up the cannons. They then set out by cutting their way to the ship. While fighting in Agua Dulces, Arthur breaks in and workers' cabin, find the captain, and is put on gunpoint by Levi Simon, which is the captain of the ship, by the way. Dutch breaks in and puts Simon at gunpoint before Fusar aims his own gun at Dutch. The standoff ends and Arthur kicks the ship captain's rifle and he kills Simon by shooting him in the chest. Fusar flees the cabin and in the confusion and runs. He then set out fighting their way to the ship in earnest. When they fight Fusar, he has occupied the final tower with a machine gun. Arthur blows down the tower, killing Fusar and allowing the gang to depart the island at last. That's kind of the wrap-up for the Guarma chapter. You see Alberto Fusar at the San Denis party mentioned earlier. Just kind of wanted to put that out there as well. Arthur arrives at Van Horn's trading post where he steals a horse to return to Shady Belle. The site is abandoned where he gets there, but he then finds a letter written by Caroline which says that they're at Lakay. As he prepares to head out, a group of Pinkertons arrives. Arthur either leaves silently and without alerting them or fights them. Regardless of his choice, he heads out to Lakay. Immediately after, when he arrives, he finds the entire gang who weren't stranded on Guarma. They welcome him, and Abigail informs Arthur of John's imprisonment at Siska Penitentiary before the rest of the gang arrive. However, their reunion is cut short by the arrival of Agent Milton and a group of Pinkerton agents who attack the camp. With the help of Sadie and Bill, they repel the attack with the aid of the Gatling gun. Sadie then asks Arthur to meet her at some point in San Denis so that they can brainstorm how to best break John out of the Sisika Penitentiary. Dutch orders Arthur to clear out an old hideout called Beaver Hollow, home to a group of cannibals called the Murphy Brood. Arthur brings Charles along, and Arthur tells Charles about Guarma, where he tells Arthur about the scramble to flee to the Cay. Eventually, whether through canoe or horse riding, they eventually reach Beaver Hollow. The pair sneaks through the camp, quietly killing the enemies until the alarm is sounded. The two then forcibly storm the hollow and clear out all the enemies. In doing so, they find a young girl named Meredith, who had been captured and tortured by the Brood. Arthur then takes her back to her mother in Annesburg before returning to the hollow where the rest of the gang has assembled. Drunk Molly then stumbles into the camp and says that she was the rat, telling the Pinkertons about the San Denis bank robbery. While the rest of the gang looks on shocked, Susan puts an end to her, peppering her with a shotgun. And this is kind of, we're going to get into the Beaver Hollow chapter. And this is kind of where, like, in between, like, it kind of matters if Arthur has low honor or high honor. It kind of depends on, like, how the story outcome is. And this is kind of where it matters. If Arthur has high honor while in Annesburg, Arthur notices Edith Downs, the wife of the late Thomas Downs, who he contracted tuberculosis from. Arthur walks up to her and she becomes very angry at him, understandably so, saying that it's his fault that her husband is dead and her son is working in the mines. Feeling horrible for what he did, Arthur brings Archie back from the mines and gives him some money to help rebuild their lives. Unfortunately, Edith does not want to leave and continues practicing prostitution. To make money for her family, Arthur confronts her about this out in the woods and finally convinces her to leave town. Arthur then goes to Saint Denis to meet Sadie, but is seized by a violent coughing fit and collapses. A stranger escorts him into a clinic, and a doctor named Joseph R. Barnes diagnoses Arthur with tuberculosis, which is the famous scene. Having contracted it from Thomas Downs, which we all know, several months earlier, Arthur is outcome with emotion at this news, as such an illness would mean certain death. The news shakes Arthur to his core and ultimately causes him to change and becomes a better man. Arthur meets up with Sadie following his diagnosis. She says that she wants to survey the prison to make sure John is actually there before launching a rescue attempt, and he has paid a hot air balloon operator, Arturo Bullard, to help give Arthur a tour. Arthur then uses the balloon to inspect Sisika Penitentiary to see if John is there. He spots John working field detail and the guard opens fire, forcing them to leave. When they reach the mainland, Arthur spots Sadie being chased by a group of O'Driscolls and opens fire upon them from the balloon. Bullard is shot and killed by the rival gang, and the balloon crashes. Arthur and Sadie then engage in assailants in a bloody gunfight, which they are victorious. Arthur then heads to the docks of Copperhead Landing, located a few miles from Sisika Penitentiary, to help Sadie break John out of prison. Abigail then protests that she should come, but Sadie and Arthur shut her down by saying that she would be an extra burden. Abigail reluctantly accepts this and thanks them for what they were doing. Before Arthur, Sadie sail out to the dock along the island shore. The pair climb a watchtower that overlooks the fields and take down the guard tower before opening fire and killing two other guards in the fields. They then take a prison guard named Milliken captive, and Milliken tells them that John is not working that day. Milliken hostage, they march up to the main gate of the fortress and tell them that they want to trade John for the guard. They then make the trade, and the three flee the island with enemy guards hot in pursuit. Arthur is then called on by Dutch and Micah go to help them confront Cornwall and Annesburg. They hide in the harbor near to where Cornwall is expected to arrive. Dutch waits with Arthur while Micah is set to follow one of Cornwall's aides. After hearing Cornwall talking to the Pinkertons, Dutch reveals himself. He demands that Cornwall gives him $10,000. It's just a really funny scene, kind of how Dutch, kind of how he says it. So he demands that Cornwall gives him $10,000, his boat, and safe passage out of the country. Cornwall refuses, and Dutch shoots him in the chest, killing him. Pinkertons and hired guns form the gang, and the three men narrowly fight their way out of town. During the operation, Micah manages to steal papers from the Cornwall Company, which he and Dutch keep so that they make plans. Arthur eventually heads to Saint Denis with Dutch and Sadie to ensure that Colm is hanged. Arthur then and Dutch disguise themselves as police officers, and Sadie disguises herself as the Lady of High Society, all to lessen the chances of them being recognized. They find the two O'Driscolls in the crowd and realize that there is a sniper on top of the building. Arthur eliminates the sniper, Dutch and Sadie capture the O'Driscolls, and with no one left to save him from the noose, Colm is hanged, which he was arrested for, Colm O'Driscoll's crimes. Sadie then kills both her hostage, and Dutch is in a fit of rage, leading to a shootout. After the O'Driscolls are dealt with, Dutch and Sadie return to Beaver Hollow, followed by Arthur. Arthur receives a letter from Mary, which just kind of wraps up the Mary chapter, which says that she wishes to cut ties with him, as it is the only way she can move on. While expressing regret that she could never be together, as well as sending Arthur a letter, she also sends back his wedding ring. Mary was unaware that Arthur was terminally ill with tuberculosis and that he would die soon, which is really sad. Um, kind of how that worked out. The papers that Micah stole reveal a large shipment of dynamite being transported from Ansburg to Saint Denis. So Bill and Arthur are sent to intercept it and take it for the gang, and they fend the mining company people or the guards and stuff off, and the cops, whatever, as they kind of make it there. Waves of hired guns pursue them, and they fend them off. And once they get back to safety, Micah instructs John to take the dynamite to Bacchus Bridge, and then they ask Arthur to join them later to set the dynamite up there. Arthur is also tasked by Strauss to go, and after two debtors from Fort Wallace named J. John Weathers and Arthur Londonderry, which is also just some extra stuff. Um, just if you don't have to do that mission, it's kind of optional. The money lending and other sins thing, and all that stuff. But here's a really important thing with Strauss. After either absolving or taking the debts from the debtors, Arthur returns to camp angry at the suffering Strauss had caused. He tells Strauss to get up, and takes him over to where his belongings are. Confused at what Arthur is doing, Strauss protests, but Arthur ignores him and attempts at reconciliation. He throws money at Strauss' feet and orders him to leave, which Strauss does. Arthur meets up with John at Bacchus Bridge, and the two blow it up in order to cut off the government supplies. This endeavor almost costs them their lives, but they are almost struck by the train. Afterwards, John tells Arthur that he is afraid for his family due to Dutch's descent into madness. Arthur then tells John that he agrees, which is also a very important scene, and John tells him that Abigail thinks that she knows where the money is. Arthur tells him to investigate further and talks to them afterwards. And then later on, Eagles Flies rides into Beaver Hollow and tells the gang that the army stationed at Fort Wallace has taken their horses and he needs help to go get them back. Dutch, seeing an opportunity to damage the government, agrees. He calls for Charles and Arthur to follow him, and the two worry seeing Dutch taking advantage of the Indians, considering that Dutch's recent changes in behavior, and the four men ride east, and they swim to the boat and sneak on board, and they eventually end up getting the horses back, of course. And then it kind of depends on the choice here. After reaching the shore, Eagle Flies and Dutch take the horses back to reservation, while Arthur goes to meet with Rains Fall. I think that's kind of a choice thing. But if the player does choose to decide to just go meet Captain Monroe and get the army is withholding vaccines for smallpox and stuff like that, and then it shows him a young child who has caught smallpox due to Colonel Favors stopping at shipment of vaccines from reaching the reservation, which is kind of basically what I mentioned. In order of Dutch, Arthur meets up with him and a group of Indians led by Peta and Eagle Flies. Dutch tells them that they plan on trapping his soldiers in the canyon to tar and feather them. However, Arthur sees that Dutch is simply using them and not helping them at all. He tries to dissuade them from Dutch being involved, only to be disappointed when Dutch brushes off his concerns. Reluctantly, Arthur gets to work, and he and Dutch place dynamite next to the trees and wait for the soldiers to arrive. When they do, Dutch pushes the detonator, and the trees collapse, blocking the road. The group demands that the soldiers surrender, but army reinforcements arrive, and the swarm would be ambushers. Arthur, Dutch, and the Indians fight their way down the pass, but the majority of the Indians are killed or captured, forcing Arthur and Dutch to run. They flee to the top of the cliff, and after being surrounded by army, jump to the safety of the waters below. Following the capture of Eagle Flies, a meeting is called between Colonel Favors and Rains Fall. Rains Fall asks Arthur and Charles to come along, and Arthur agrees due to pleading from Charles. During the meeting, Arthur breaks down in a fit of coughing and has to take a break in the tent. In the tent, he hears that Favors plans on executing Monroe and puts himself on the guard. After the meeting breaks down, Favors arrests Monroe and announces his plans to execute him. Charles and Arthur attack, grab him, and flee. They hide behind a rock and defeat the army in a long battle before taking the captain to Emmons Station and that's kind of writes off Captain Monroe. He was a short character, but Charles and Arthur learn that Eagle Flies is being held at Fort Wallace, so they go and save him. They break in the fort and save him. Although soldiers attempt to shoot them out of the canoes, they succeed in escaping the area because they escaped downriver on the canoes, and Charles brings Eagle Flies back to his father. Eagle Flies then shows up at Beaver Hollow with a large force of warriors from the reservation and tells the gang that the army raided the reservation. He then asks the gang to help him in destroying the Cornwall Company refinery in retaliation. It is then that Rainsfall rides in and begs for his tribe not to go to war. They instead ride off, leaving the gang behind. After a quick discussion, the majority of the gang follows. When they arrive at the scene, they see many of the Wapiti Indians had been killed. Arthur soon then spots Eagle Flies, and the gang splits into two groups. With Arthur leading the force to rescue Eagle Flies, they succeed in rescuing Eagle Flies, of course, and they meet up with Dutch's force near the warehouse. After fighting through the warehouse doors, Dutch and Arthur enter it to take the government bonds. As they leave, however, a pipe bursts which incapacitates Arthur immediately afterwards. The soldiers arrive, while Dutch leaves Arthur to die just before they can be killed by the soldiers. However, Eagle Flies appears and kills the soldiers in rapid succession, only to be fatally shot in the abdomen by Colonel Favors himself. Favors then turns towards Arthur to kill him too, but Arthur manages to shoot and kill him first. He then exits the warehouse, and after a brief exchange with Dutch calling him out over the latter abandoning him, Arthur takes Eagle Flies back to the reservation with Charles and Peta. They then reach the reservation. Eagle Flies succeeds to his wounds, and he ends up dying, unfortunately. While Arthur says goodbye to Charles, who stays with the Indians to help them escape the army, soon after leaving the reservation, Arthur suffers from a second severe coughing fit and falls into unconsciousness. Luckily for him, the German family who he had helped earlier that year find him and help him take him to Annisburg, where Arthur regains consciousness. Dutch announces to the gang they are pulling off one more big heist before leaving the country. He then tells them that they are going to rob an army train going through Saint Denis containing payroll and supplies to repair the Bacchus Bridge. They then ride to Saint Denis, but after the train goes through the city, they are so forced to go out in pursuit of it. After boarding the train, swerves of enemies assault the gang, and although Arthur fights them off, John is shot in the left shoulder, and after uncoupling a burning train carriage, Dutch says that he will rescue him, and goes after him while the rest of the gang eliminate the final soldiers guarding the train and take the loot. After this, Dutch appears and tells John that he had died, or tells Arthur that John had died, leaving Arthur saddened. To return, they come across Tilly, who says Abigail has been captured. Dutch and Micah decide to leave her, followed by the others, refusing to leave his old friend to die and have Jack become an orphan. Arthur and Sadie go to Van Horn to then save Abigail, who she's being covered by. Arthur covers Sadie from a lighthouse while she fights her way through the town, but after reaching the building where Abigail is being held, she is ambushed by two Pinkertons and captured. Arthur then fights his way to the town to rescue her and kills the guards who she is ambushed by, only to be held at gunpoint by Agent Milton. Milton tells him that Micah betrayed the gang and fed information to the Pinkertons since his return from Guarma, which kind of makes sense. Before being locked in a struggle with Arthur, suddenly Abigail shoots Milton in the temple with Sadie's revolver, killing him and saving Arthur. Arthur then takes Abigail back to Tilly and Jack and then tells him to leave with Sadie. While he confronts Micah before she leaves, Abigail gives Arthur the keys to Dutch's money stash and tells him where to find the money before saying goodbye. Arthur walks into the camp and announces that Micah is a traitor, which results in Micah and Arthur drawing on each other. At first, no one is willing to take sides until John stumbles into the camp saying that Dutch left him to die. Susan also sides with Arthur and threatens Micah with a shotgun. Unfortunately for her, Javier announces that the Pinkertons are coming, distracting her and allowing her, it distracts Miss Grimshaw and allows Micah to kill her. The rest of the gang unites behind Dutch and Micah, but Pinkertons arrive before Arthur and John can be killed by the others. Arthur and John escape through the cave, where Arthur reveals to him that Micah is the rat. After reaching the surface, Arthur tells John that his family are safe at Copperhead Landing, and then tells him to make a good life for him and his family with the second chance he has before they are forced to escape in the woods. With Dutch and Arthur's on their trail, exclaiming that John and Arthur are traitors, eventually Arthur and John have their horses shot from underneath them, forcing them to go on foot and killing Pinkerton attackers. Arthur then has a difficult choice to make. He can either return for the money or assist in John's escape. If Arthur helps John escape, which is the player's choice, Arthur continues on with John and the two head towards the mountains. Eventually, Arthur tells John to continue along while he holds the Pinkertons, before giving him his hat and belongings. John reluctantly parts with Arthur while the latter is attacked by Micah. Both men fall from a ledge onto the ground below and subsequently engage in a fistfight. After a lengthy brawl in which both men sustain numerous physical injuries, Arthur manages to pistol whip Micah across the face with one of his revolvers after being pinned against the wall but loses his grip on it. Arthur then crawls towards the revolver in order to kill Micah, but is ultimately prevented from doing so by Dutch. Arthur tells Dutch again that Micah is the rat, that he gave him everything, and that John is the only one who made it. While Micah picks up another one of his revolvers from the ground and prompts Dutch to come up with him and get the money in the end, Dutch discontentedly walks away, abandoning both Arthur and Micah. Now, if the player has high honor after Dutch abandoned him, and this is kind of where I mentioned that it kind of shifts depending on your honor, Micah angrily walks away from the area, leaving Arthur to die. Arthur then crawls to the edge of the cliff and witnesses his final sunrise as he passes away, succumbing to his tuberculosis, his injuries, and exhaustion, which is a really beautiful scene, which really kind of cements this game being a very beautiful game, Red Dead Redemption 2. And if the player has low honor, instead of fleeing after Dutch walks away, Micah approaches Arthur and aims a revolver at his head, eventually claiming that Arthur is not better than him. Micah then shoots Arthur in the forehead, killing him instantly before laughing, spitting on his corpse, and leaving. And then if Arthur goes back for the money, Arthur gives John his hat and belongings and then leaves John to flee by himself, before fighting his way back to the gang's camp, where he manages to find the sack of money in Dutch's chest inside the cavern. As he exits the cave, he is suddenly attacked by Micah and stabbed in the side of his own knife. After wrestling Micah off of him and taking back his knife, Micah takes out his own blade and the two engage in a knife fight. If the player has high honor, eventually Arthur manages to slash Micah's left eye, blinding it. Enraged, Micah attacks Arthur to the ground and tries to stab him, but to no avail, as Arthur bites Micah's hand and punches him in the face, forcing him off. Duchess arrives to break it up, but after Arthur reiterates that Micah betrayed the gang, Dutch decides to abandon both of them, despite Micah dismissing the claim as nonsense. Micah then leaves, taking the sack of money which Arthur took from the chest. Arthur is left to die and watches the sunrise shortly before he succumbs to his tuberculosis, his initial stab wound, and exhaustion. If the player has low honor, instead of slashing Micah's left eye during the fight, Arthur loses his balance and is tackled to the ground. Micah manages to stab Arthur in the chest during the struggle, and before Dutch arrives to break it up, Arthur says it again that Micah is the rat and demands that Dutch kill him. But Dutch then walks away, of course. Arthur then begins to crawl away, but Micah approaches him with a knife and finishes Arthur off by stabbing him in the back. So most of the low honor, it's sad that Arthur dies, but most of the low honor things, when he dies, for low honor, it's really sad. It's sad either way, but it's just really sad. It's just sad. It's sad all around. I don't know how else to say it. Depending on how Arthur died, a deer basking in the sunlight, high honor, or coyote in the rain, low honor, is seen while the song Crash of Worlds by Rocco DeLuca, a beautiful song by the way, plays in the background. Its tone differs according to honor. At some point after his death, Arthur's body was found by Charles Smith, who buried him in a beautiful location facing the evening sun, the way he would have wanted. The grave can be found in Ambrino, northeast of Bacchus Bridge, which John can kind of go there and stuff like that. In like the prologue, you could go there as John, and also other gang members' graves you could visit. But that is Arthur Morgan, ladies and gentlemen. He has to be one of my, and I know a lot of other people's, favorite characters in video game history, I have to say. He is a very great character. His story is really beautiful, and his story is also kind of sad. In both ways, it's beautiful and sad, but that can be said about the whole Red Dead 2 story in general. But they wrote him great. Now, there's a lot of other Red Dead characters that I also think the same way of, but particularly Arthur Morgan, just because he's a main character. I think he's an amazing character. He's written very well. He has a lot of good personality traits. He's everything. He's trying to, towards the end, like when he gets sick like that with tuberculosis, like obviously, like he started seeing things differently, and honestly, I feel like anybody else would, but he's just a great character overall, and at the time, this is perhaps one of the biggest character analysis I've ever done so far on this channel. At the time I'm recording this, probably a little bit extra when you guys are seeing it, it's 52 minutes. It just hit 53-minute record time. It's a big character analysis, but like I said, there was a lot we have to talk to. We kind of talk about with Arthur Morgan, and just because I love him as a character, he's an amazing character, and just because he's one of the biggest characters probably I've ever went over with a lot of the extra stuff here on the wiki, it's amazing. He's an amazing character, and I really enjoy him, and I know a lot of other people do, and that's pretty much what I think about Arthur. I'm going to go over a little bit extra here before we wrap up the video. Just his appearance here on the wiki. So as seen in an old photograph on Arthur's wagon before 1899, Arthur was seen as a young man wearing a brown vest and trousers with a bandana around his neck. And as of 1899, Arthur is approximately 36 years of age. He's pretty young. I actually thought he was a little bit older, but with a muscular build perfect for his position, with a head of thick light brown hair and blue eyes. He also has a scar near his chin, which leaves a bald patch visible, I should say, in his beard around level 2 or 3. Arthur's physical appearance can be influenced by the player, of course. The player can choose his hairstyle, clothing, and cleanliness, Players must also take basic care of Arthur, which in turn influences his weight. A healthy Arthur will retain his stocky appearance. Overfeeding him will lead to weight gain, giving him more health but limiting his stamina. While neglecting nutrition will thin Arthur out, negatively affecting his health but increasing his stamina. During his time in Guarma, Arthur's face becomes red and sunburnt, with both his hair and beard growing progressively longer, as there is no way to shave or cut his hair. Arthur is also underweight due to lack of food, and he only wears one outfit, the remnants of the suit he wore during the St. Denis bank heist. That was strictly in Guarma. And after returning from Guarma, Arthur's health takes its turn for the worst as his tuberculosis progresses. He looks increasingly sick, and his face becomes pale, with his eyes becoming watery and red in the corners, of course. And the attention to detail, like, at first you see him in the beginning of the story, he's like a pretty healthy man. He's like, has a lot of stocky build and everything. And of course, as his tuberculosis gets worse, his eyes get red and stuff like that. Like he's visibly sick as it, gets worse. So the attention to detail is amazing on that. He also develops eye bags as a result of constant coughing. Arthur also loses his muscular appearance and becomes extremely thin, which is also very, very noticeable. Great attention to detail because obviously, he is very sick. But once his sickness worsens, Arthur becomes permanently underweight and cannot return to a healthy weight through any means. But most of his, like, how he looks and stuff like that is, it's kind of influenced by the player. Like, if you want to keep him underweight, overweight, or pretty moderate weight, stuff like that. It's mostly up to the player, but especially towards the end, obviously he gets sick and he gets more thin, and it's just he just looks horrible. I mean, this is as best as I could put it. He looks horrible towards the end of the game. But yeah, that's just a little bit extra, but this is probably far one of the biggest character analysis I've ever done. Or not the biggest, but the longest, I should say. In terms of like video length, but that's okay. I knew I kind of was preparing for it after seeing the how long the wiki was in the article, but Arthur Morgan is one of my favorite characters in video game history, amongst others, and I really wanted to give it a good run. Make sure I went over everything, and everything, because he is one of the main characters in Red Dead 2, of course. I just want to make sure I was very thorough with it. But yeah, we're kind of kicking off our Red Dead 2 character analysis here. There's probably less characters I want to do in Red Dead 2. There's a lot of interesting characters, but there's probably less than Red Dead 1. We'll be going over there, but it's kind of just to kick it off. Obviously, Arthur Morgan is the main character, so I'm going to do him first. But I got a lot of other things I want to talk about with different characters and stuff like that, so stay tuned for that. We're kind of kicking it off here. Like I said, it might take me a while in between character analysis for Red Dead 2. But yeah, we're getting there. But yeah, if you made it this far to the end of the video, I appreciate you watching. I know it was an extra lengthy one. Plus, I know our Mafia gameplay a day or two ago, that was pretty lengthy too, almost an hour, probably the same amount of time. But I appreciate you guys if you watch both those episodes. I know it's probably one of the longer episodes here on the channel, but we'll have that depending on the nature of the video. But yeah, leave a comment down below if you like Arthur Morgan as a main character and you think that he was well written. If you think the same as I do, comment down below. If you think he was well written and then did a great job on him, and he's a good main character and stuff like that. And if you think he was well written, all that good stuff. Or if you don't really like him, leave a comment down below and why. Just discuss all that in the comments. Feedback, all that stuff. What you think of Arthur Morgan and Red Dead 2 as a game. Leave all that comments down. Leave it all in the comments. So I enjoy to see discussions and whatnot, and I'll join in. But yeah, with everything being said, to wrap up this very long video, make sure to subscribe for more content. Like the video, all good stuff, Discord, Twitch, Instagram, links in the description. With all that being said, we got a lot of stuff coming. I know I mentioned already, but we got a lot of stuff planned for the channel. And yeah, stay tuned.